It's 1:30 and I'm going to get us started on time. My name is Madeleine Mineau. I'm Chief Operating Officer of Essex Hydro. In my day job, I manage the operations of 14 small hydropower projects in Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, and it's really fun and interesting work. Today, we're here for the Distributed Energy Resources panel, and someone a little earlier asked me what panel I was on, and I said the DER panel, and they said, what is DERs? So I figured I would start by talking about that. So when we're talking about distributed energy resources, or DERs, we're talking about things that are on the smaller scale, so we're not talking about utility scale projects. They are typically lots of places, that's the distributed part. They're interconnected, often behind the meter, at your home, at your business, interacting with the distribution system. So a lot of times the distribution utility has a role to play. Some of them are generation, it could be storage, it could be your thermostat. It's a lot of smart devices that may control the energy use in your home, be able to be smart and responsive, and in that way manage our energy use. So there's not a clear answer of what is a distributed energy resource, because it's lots of things in lots of places. So as we're aiming to progress in the clean energy transition, we are going to move from a model of very large centralized power plants to one where distributed energy resources is playing a more and more important role. And when I think of distributed energy resources, I think of the saying, many hands make light work. So all of these resources individually don't do much, or they don't generate much. But the wonderful thing is that you can look at them in aggregate. If you look at the effect on the ISO grid of all of the distributed solar, it's making a huge impact. So I think of the DERs really doing the job of many hands making light work. So we're going to look at DERs through three different lenses with our three wonderful speakers today. We're going to talk about the New Hampshire state programs that are currently established and available. We're going to focus on one of the big challenges, maybe I would say, of DERs, which is interconnection. And then we're also going to talk about the role and importance of data in being able to use those DERs. So the session format is that each of our speakers is going to give a very short presentation, and then I have some questions for them, and then we'll open it up for your questions. So our wonderful speakers today are Deandra Perruccio. She's the administrator of the Sustainable Energy team at the State Department of Energy. We also have Matt Doubleday. He's Director of Interconnections at Rewild Renewables, and Josh Brock, who is Vice President of CCA Commercial Operations at Calpine Energy Solutions. We're going to lead it off with Deandra.
Hey folks, yeah, as Madeleine said, Deandra Perruccio. I work with the sustainable team here at the relatively new still, New Hampshire Department of Energy. So we our main function is administering the state RPS, and we have a renewable energy fund that has, depending on the RPS policies, has been roughly $4 million each year. We run a number of programs using that fund. And then we also administer the net metering and group net metering statutes and policies for the state through our team and our legal team. So I am going to be focusing on group net metering specifically, and I'm going to try to, there's a lot here. I will say it's a relatively complex policy, so I'm going to try to give a brief overview of the developments in the state over the last few years. There's been a lot of changes, and we'll have, I think, time for questions at the end of the session. So definitely, if we want to get into any of these in more detail, we can. Net metering, I'm going to assume that people have a base understanding. We have information on our website if that's a new concept to you, but I'm going to move through these pretty quickly here. Just wanted to show the bill components, and specifically here that yellow is the energy supply or energy service portion of a bill, and then the green is distribution, and transmission is the blue. So when we talk about net metering tariffs and net metering compensation, those are the components of a bill that are eligible for compensation for any power that you export onto the grid. This is our small customer generator tariff. The important takeaway here, NEM 1 is something that was in place prior to 2017, so you really want to focus on NEM 2, where for small customer generators, the tariff is full 100% of service or supply can sometimes be called 25% of distribution and 100% of transmission. So those sort of pieces of the pie that I was showing in the previous slide. And then for large customer generators, the tariff, the compensation is 100% of that energy service or supply portion of your rate. So group net metering, how many folks in this room have heard of that term, either virtual net metering or group net metering? Okay, great, okay. So virtual net metering, people talk about that often as well, and New Hampshire's policy is called group net metering. It works, I think, slightly differently than some other, states in this area, so but it is similar. So this is a way that you can have one single customer generator that's considered the host. They're called the host in New Hampshire statute, that is able to share the proceeds from their exported generation with members of a group. And for New Hampshire, large customer generators in this state, so anything over that 100 kW, are required to register as a group if they're not using 20% of the power that they generate behind the meter. Rules to qualify for group net metering, there is a requirement within the statute that the total load, so how much power is being used over the course of the year, between the host and the members must at least equal the power that's generated by the system. So this is basically a policy that you cannot over-generate in order to be registered. So you have to demonstrate that your members are going to use all of the power and or your host. The tariff, the compensation, is based on the host account. So in order to be eligible for the compensation on those other two slides, the host account is required to be on default supply, so taking their service or supply from their utility. There's a new statute in place for municipal host, which allows groups to group net meter up to 5 megawatts. A requirement there is that you need to meet the definition for all of your members of political subdivision. That's outlined in the statute, and you can give more information on that if people are interested. And there must be an agreement in place between yourself and your members. All of this is in our PUC 900 rules. That's where you can find all of the detail on how group net metering works in New Hampshire. There's a few different forms that have to be done. There's an application that's on our website. You can use the 909 form, and then there's annual reporting that's required. So the host is required each year to file a report with both the Department of Energy and the utility to basically demonstrate that that load to generation requirement is being met. So they need to supply how much power their members used and their host used throughout the year, along with how much the system generated. So there are a number of group net metering options available now in New Hampshire. One important thing to note here is that the co-op, after 2017, basically, the co-op now offers its own net metering program. So, the net metering that I'm discussing here, if you're in or looking at a project in the co-op territory, would not apply. You would need to reach out to them to find out what types of tariffs they offer. So there are really three options here. There's traditional group net metering. This is where and I'll go into a little more detail about those, but traditional group net metering where the host is receiving a check. On-bill credit, which is allowing you to directly apply credits to your members on their bill. And then there is a low moderate income adder. So this is an additional 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour for qualifying projects. So traditional group net metering, this is the sort of oldest form that we have in place. This is where your host and your members, you get registered, and the utility is sending the host a check for the value of the excess generation on a monthly basis that the host is then responsible for distributing to its members per whatever the terms of their member agreement are. So this is the host receiving a check monthly and then distributing that payment to their members. On-bill crediting has been effective since 2019, so this is relatively new. It allows the monetary credits to be allocated directly to group members. I think that's relatively self-explanatory, but if people have questions. And I think the examples do a better job of sort of showing how this works. So here's an on-bill credit example. In this case, we have a project that is 1,000 kilowatt hours produced in a month. The way the amount, the monetary value is calculated, is the tariff times the kilowatt hours produced. I think a lot of people get confused because in some states, there's a direct kilowatt hour to kilowatt hour application from host to members. That is not how the program works in New Hampshire. In New Hampshire, the full amount of excess generation is multiplied by the applicable tariff, and that gives you a monetary value. And then you, as the host, are determining of that entire monetary value, what percentage of those values would you like to go to each member? So in this example, the host is keeping 50%, and then they've allocated 20, 20, and 10%, which based on $100 total monetary credit splits out to those amounts. The LMI adder, so this is an additional 2.5 cents that's available to group projects that qualify as low, moderate income community solar projects. There is a section of the statute that outlines all of those requirements in detail, but to sum up, these projects need to either directly benefit a group that has at least 5 end user customers, so 5 residential customers that have bills in their own name, where the majority of those qualify as LMI, which is 300% of the federal poverty guideline or below, or it needs to be able to directly benefit basically eligible housing, affordable housing properties, provided again that the majority of those residents meet the LMI requirement, which here is 80% of the area median income. These projects also have a requirement that no more than 50% of the load, how I was mentioning that you need to show your load, your host load and your member load, that load amount for an entire group for low moderate income community solar can be no more than 15% for non-residential members. So you could have a business or a school, commercial account, but it could not represent more than 15% of the total load of the project. This just outlines some of the direct benefit requirements. On-bill credits are obviously the simplest, most clear direct benefit, but there's a number of, if it's an affordable housing authority, there's a number of other direct benefits that may be considered. So I'd suggest if you're interested in these types of projects that you review that. And the other couple important requirements for these projects is one, that at least 12%, a minimum of 12% of that monetary credit must go to the LMI participants or the LMI members. And that the LMI members are not allowed to be charged a subscription fee, termination, any kinds of outside fees or arrangements are not allowed for these projects. Here's an LMI community solar project example. So in this case, it's a 10,000 kilowatt hours are produced in 1 month. That gives you your tariff amount plus your LMI adder together, giving you $1,450 in this example. You're then allocating a percentage of that monetary value to your members. Again, 12%, you can see here at the bottom that the total credit to your LMI members must be at least 12%. In this example, we're giving up at the top, you have 10 members, 10 LMI members, so 15 members total, 10 of which are LMI. You're meeting that majority requirement. You have at least 5 households, and you're giving 5% to each LMI member, so it's 50% total. So this meets all of the requirements. This is another example using the housing authority. One thing to note is that the percentage allocation of your monetary credit may or may not align with your load numbers. So this may be a good example where potentially, if this is a school or some sort of property up at the top that has a significant load number, their load may be 15% of the total group load, but you can see here that the percentage allocation they're getting of the credit is only 10%. I think people get confused and think that those have to match. The amount of monetary credit you're providing does not necessarily align with the load of your members or your host load. And then I'll just very briefly go over a couple recent changes. As I think I mentioned this earlier, municipal group hosting, this was just enabled a couple years ago. And this allows group net metering for projects from 1 to 5 megawatts if all of the members meet the definition of political subdivision. I think it's mostly aimed at sort of state and town buildings, but there's some other qualifying entities in there. And then SB 270, this was Senate Bill 270, passed in 2022. This creates a new process for access to the LMI adder through the Electric Assistance Program. So we're calling it the EAP LMI adder program. That process is being developed currently at the department. We are hopeful that there will be applications available for those projects online before the end of this year. So keep an eye out for that. And there is actually also a draft process proposal. So if people are interested in how that works, functionally the utility is selecting and allocating the members as well as managing the group changes. The developer is really just proposing the project, and it's selected on which projects will be providing the highest amount of benefit to LMI members. And I think that is all I have. So thank you, folks. Happy to answer questions.
Yeah, we'll do questions at the end. So our next speaker is Matt Doubleday, and I'm just going to scooch through until we get to his slides. Matt.
Our wires up here may not be OSHA compliant. Hi, everyone. My name is Matt Doubleday. I am the Director of Interconnection. Thank you. At Rewild Renewables, we're a solar and storage developer, primarily developing projects in the Northeast. We also do have a history of financing and owning projects, and we've interconnected about 75 megawatts in Maine and Massachusetts each. We also have projects in New Hampshire, in Vermont, and in California. And we're developing projects continually in New Hampshire, in Massachusetts, in Delaware, and a few other states. So I'll be speaking today about solar development, interconnection, and some hurdles that we're currently experiencing, but some optimism as well, and some ways that we think that the challenges of interconnection could be overcome in the near term and the long term. So very quickly, solar development 101 in one slide. With development, you pretty much always have three main entitlements. The projects that I'm speaking about, Madeleine said earlier that DERs are typically the smaller end. We work on the larger end of that smaller end. So we're working on projects that are up to about 5 megawatts AC. So these are projects that you can still interconnect to the distributed system. You're not working on a utility scale process and therefore going to the transmission system. So for those projects, you typically have your real estate. So that's speaking directly with a landowner, either leasing their land or purchasing their land, basically getting that title so that you can actually develop the project on that parcel. Your permitting, so that's state level permitting, local permitting, sometimes county permitting. This can include just a wide array of different things, and it's very state-based, town-based, municipal-based. Won't get into that too much just because interconnection is what I spend my days on, but it is a very important aspect of development as well. And then interconnection, of course, so you can't just connect this large project to the distributed system. You need to have the utility study it, make sure that it's safe to interconnect, and with the projects that we work on, we almost always have upgrades, almost always have pretty significant upgrades as well to the distributed system so that our projects can actually interconnect. So once those three entitlements are obtained, a project typically will go and register for an incentive program like net metering or group net metering, and proceed with financing and construction. So that's generally how it works, but if there is no state incentive program, if there's uncertainty around a program like net metering or another program that may be in place, then you're not going to get a lot of projects developing in a state. So having certainty around the state-based process and program, as well as certainty around the interconnection process, timelines, and transparency into those timelines, you're not going to see a lot of investment into state-level programs. So that is a big theme that we see and that we want to focus on, is that we need certainty for projects to become a reality. We don't want to start developing a project and then 2 years from that point where we start developing, the program changes significantly, and we've basically lost all the money that we've developed. So interconnection, it can be a pretty long process, interconnection, as well as all of these things, and I'll get into some of the general timelines we see. But I kind of already hit on this, so I'll quickly go over this slide. We need to get the approval from the utility, and that occurs through a system impact study, which takes our project at the location on the distribution system and studies it for several different things. And then it tells us this is what we need to do to our distribution system to accommodate your project. And if we say, yep, that sounds good, we'll move forward with that, we sign an interconnection agreement. We may receive that information and say, doesn't look great, but we still think there's something here. What if we reduced our project by 20%? Could that eliminate some of these upgrades and maybe make the project move forward? Or it might just not work at all, and we might just go, you know what, this one's not going to work. We'll just move on from this project. So from the time when an application starts, when you submit your initial application to the utility, to receiving that interconnection agreement, building your project, and then getting to commercial operation, typically takes at minimum 18 months. So that's where the certainty comes into play that I was speaking about. We really need process and regulatory level certainty in order to develop these projects effectively. 18 months is best case scenario by a long shot. We have projects that have been in Massachusetts interconnection queue since 2018, so for 5 years, and they're about 3 years from being interconnected. So we're looking at an 8-year investment in these projects before we can actually start making money on them. So some challenges, each state handles distributed interconnection in a different way. State rules are state specific, and therefore some states move more quickly and some states move at a slower rate. So time can kill projects. If a project submits its application and it spends 3 years in the interconnection queue, that project might not be worthwhile to move forward with. So long waits in the queue can really impact project success. And that coupled with procedures that may not be as quick as they could be can create even longer development risks and development waiting periods. So there's the procedures that we see changing across different states. What we do in New Hampshire is different than what we do in Massachusetts. So that's one challenge, but a much larger one that we're seeing is that costs are increasing significantly, and outdated cost allocation models are making it very difficult for new DERs to come onto the grid. So there's a cost causation model that has been in place and is kind of like the status quo for most states. And to explain that very quickly using like a residential system, if you are on a street and you have 4 neighbors, so there's 5 houses, and all 5 houses decide that they're going to move forward with solar, the first 2 houses could connect to the system for very little money and not need to deal with any upgrades. That third house might hit a transformer upgrade, need to pay for that before they can move forward with their system. They pay for it, they move forward, and then houses 4 and 5 can benefit from that transformer and connect to the grid. That's cost causation. Basically, if you're the one that comes along and triggers this upgrade, you pay for it, and there is no sharing of the cost. Projects 4 and 5 in that scenario still use the upgrade. So one thing that we are pushing for as an industry, and a lot of utilities are on board with, is sharing those costs so that everyone that's actually using the upgrade is paying their fair share. That makes projects make investments in a much greater way in certain states that allow for cost sharing. Massachusetts is a state that is leading on cost sharing, and you see a lot of investment into DERs in Massachusetts. So overcoming some of these challenges, we are going to need to build out the grid for many different reasons. For DERs, like wind and solar is one reason, but we also need that for increased electrification, and we need it for electric vehicles and for heat pumps. So building out the grid and increasing the capacity of the grid is going to benefit not only DERs, but a lot of other things that we're speaking about at this conference. Integrating energy storage. Storage is a great tool that needs to be used more and more in different states, as you have solar, which is a very intermittent resource, wind, another intermittent resource. Storage can improve that relationship between these intermittent resources and the grid. It can take solar that's produced in the middle of the day when it may not be needed and push it to the end of the day when the peak is at its highest. And then the final thing is policy and regulatory improvements. Again, certainty around these things is something that we speak about quite a bit at Rewild and we push for in the states where we operate. We really need there to be a stable regulatory and policy environment for these projects to work. When they have 2 to 5 or 6 year development cycles, you need to understand what that regulatory environment is going to look like in 4 or 5 years. Technology is another piece that we think could be improved upon in the regulatory space. We're using inverters now on these solar systems that are called smart inverters, and they can work with the grid to help with things that solar and other intermittent resources cause negatively on the grid. So one example of this is something like what's called flicker. So if you have a bright sunny day like today and you have a solar field, a cloud rolls over and all of a sudden the solar production starts going up and down. That is creating a situation on the grid called flicker, and without some sort of protection that could impact all of the customers in that area. These smart inverters have software in them, like built into them, that allows the inverter itself to mitigate this before it hits the grid. So having utilities and states continually using smart inverters, updating their procedures for using things like smart inverters and other lower cost technology to integrate DERs is something that's very important. I think that's all I have. Thanks.
Great, thank you. As I'm fast forwarding to Josh's presentation, Matt had a great point. I talked about DERs being really small, but what is small to me is not necessarily small to you. So generally we think of the upper end of DERs as being 5 megawatts, because at 5 megawatts, ISO New England wants to start to have visibility into your project. And so that's sort of 4.99 megawatts is the cutoff from like really teeny tiny right up to 4.9 megawatts. Josh.
Cool. All right. Let me do, I have a fairly short presentation, so let me just ask the room a couple questions. I'm curious where everyone's from here, so we'll do the raise of hand game here. People from the utility space, working for utilities or in that, lovely. Any developers in the room? All right, good number of developers. Local governments, cities, towns, counties, principalities, fiefdoms. So yeah, all right, good representation. Unrepresented, other people, classes I haven't called, consultants, owners, operators. I never know where to draw the line. Like,
We're not developing anything new, but we operate our current.
Yeah, I don't know where I fall in this category of things as well. So, but it's just helpful to contextualize there. So, and then who was here this morning for Jennifer's presentation from the DOE? Yeah, like fantastic, right? And she, I love that report. I've cited it a lot. I almost stole some of the graphics and then stole some less cool graphics. Now I feel silly for not doing that. But she did an amazing job, and hopefully that's a great primer. It actually accelerates a little bit of the conversation I'm having here. But functionally, what I want to talk to you all about is a little bit more of the smaller side of DER from like an asset scale standpoint, but only because it's divided amongst a large number of devices. But really, I want to talk about data and how data really is driving both the future of what the grid is going to be, as well as the decisions that we need to make to sort of actualize that future. So some of this is redundant. We already sort of got into this, right? So you all know this, you've probably heard it, but just to run it through, right? So like on the left is like the grid 100 years ago, and really, quite frankly, many places, the grid today. In the world that we're all working towards and in piecemeal function have moved to is this thing on the, what is this, your right? There we go. Which sort of, postulates that the grid doesn't have to be the singular function where you've got large assets far away pushing power into population centers and we all just consume whatever arrives at us, right? It postulates that power could also be megawatts or virtual power plants or, sort of choose your term. But it can be a function of many of us participating in that market, both DER assets, like we've talked about here, which is in front of the meter, solar. Actually, I'll switch to the next slide because that's sort of where I'm at on this, right? So it can be lots of different things, right? It can be these larger scale, but still small in the scale of power plants, solar assets, wind, biomethane, biomass, these other sort of generators that have a smaller scale, a handful of megawatts, kilowatts to a handful of megawatts. But also it could be lots of other things, right? And because a DER is many things, each one of those will fit into the grid differently. And that's important because I would challenge all of us to try and postulate or articulate what the grid is, right? Electricity all on its own is like the formulation of like 12 different electric theories that we now call electricity. It's when you break it down like that, you really start to like unravel in your mind around how in the world did we figure this out? We've built the largest machine in the world, which is the grid, right? And it operates at this, fingernail depth of precision. It's amazing. And DERs are positioned to start to fit into that. But how they do so is yet to be fully actualized, and how we get there can be a challenge. And one of the primary issues that we need to solve for is data. As you just heard, let me just sort of walk you through data from like the top to the bottom of it all, right? So data is anything and everything, right? But I'm going to try and narrow us down to perhaps what are the most important pieces to it. Or at least a couple categories of it. So data, it can be the geospatial overlay. It's the grid in and of itself, right? So where can I build? Where is there hosting capacity? That's an important piece of information. If you're going to purchase a piece of land, you kind of want to know where is it in proximity to an interconnection point, and how much hosting capacity does that interconnection point have? That's an important piece of data that we had. And that drives the where and the what that we build, right? And developers, as you all in the room know this, like you'll probably look at a number of different sites and you'll go through the math on all of these different things. What's it going to cost to interconnect? How close am I to it? Am I going to be the lucky fifth house that has to pay for a massive upgrade? There's all these challenges that go into that, right? So the more that data is transparent, the more efficient that the developers and larger scale people who are doing greenfield or brownfield development, steel in the ground. The more that data is available, transparent, accessible, the better decisions that they can make and do it more efficiently. So that's one thing. But in the context of sort of this future that we're talking about, where the grid is interactive, the questions become a little bit more interesting, and that is, what does the grid need, right? And then what does the community need? And I'll give an example of my community. So I'm from San Diego, in Southern California. You can actually see Mexico from my house, just to tell you. It was 80 degrees when I left. Don't know why I'm telling you that, other than just to highlight it's a wonderful place to be. We have a lot of fires, right? We don't have a lot of rain. We got under 8 inches a year. We have a lot of fires, and we have a function, not a function. We had this natural barrier that sort of came into, and it's now described as the urban wildlands interface. And that's basically where development went from urban and suburban into more rural, right? And so we've got communities that more or less ring into that space. And what happens is that when hot winds blow through, that's why it was 80 degrees, by the way. It was 80 degrees and 12% humidity. So if you lit a match, and some people did, things will burn. And that's a problem that we have to deal with, right? But in the context of the grid, and where I'm going with this, is that in that community, one of the things we had to solve for is the grid is going to go down if fires happen in this community, right? So how do I support my community in the event of a grid outage where there is a natural disaster, or I have to turn the power off so that it doesn't get worse? How can I still support my communities, my medical baseline people that have to have that ventilator on? What can I do to help support that critical need that my community represents? And restated another way, how can I make my community resilient? Right? And so knowing, for example, how often a part of the grid goes down, why it goes down, that data can drive those decisions that a developer probably doesn't care as much about, because maybe it's at the distribution side of the grid, right? They're looking more at the transmission side. But as a community, we do care, and it's really important. And then let's take it one down before that, right? So, ultimately, what I'm really interested in, what I think is a huge part of our future, and what Jennifer was talking about earlier today, is that we have ultimately, at the end of the day, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of assets behind the meter that can provide services to the grid. And the thing is that those assets are going to get deployed regardless of what any of us do. Nest is still selling thermostats to everyone, not because those are, the solution to lowering their bill, but because for a lot of us, they were cool. Or when I upgraded my HVAC, I had to get a new thermostat, and that thing just looks really neat on my wall, and I heard it does stuff. I don't know what, but why not? My water heater went out, and now that heat pump water heater is more affordable for me to do it. Oh, and by the way, it's grid interactive. I have no idea what that means, but whatever, right? Or now I have EV charging that's Wi-Fi connected, so I can control it on my phone, but also I can now make that a demand response asset, right? Those ands aren't part of our purchasing decision, right? But they are consequential to the grid. However, all of that, because it sits behind a meter and that meter is not discretely controlled and just a function of generation, we have to have a way to really determine what happens behind the meter, so then we can value that, incentivize it, and make sure that the market can transact on that. And that's really what I'm here for. So this idea that we need data that is solid, reliable, timely, accurate, it's really, really important, because ultimately if we can do that, we can shift away from a lot of fossil fuel generation peaker plants, as Jennifer was talking about, and we can replace that with behind the meter assets. And as long as that we have really solid data that can value that, then not only are we able to avoid the impact of using those fossil assets, but it is one of the most powerful tools, and I don't think this is fully appreciated, for us to take money and directly reinvest it in our communities. Because now, if I'm the Community Power Coalition of New Hampshire or another community power agency, I have a choice now. I could buy power from a power plant, and I'm going to do that. But if I can also buy power from your home and your home or your home, or the equivalent of power by messing with your demand, by augmenting it, I can pay you for that. And that takes all that money and just puts it right back into my community. And that's really, really powerful. And it's a material amount of money. It's millions, and just in California alone, for example, we spend billions of dollars a year on our energy bills, right? So even if I took 5% of that and were able to reinvest in my community, that's a material amount of money, and that's especially true for any of us that experience energy poverty, right? So it's really, really important that we actualize on this, but to get there, we need data. And so what do we need to do, and like, what does that mean, right? So two primary things, and I'm almost done, I've got one more slide. The first one is we need system enhancements, right? So for our utility partners in the room, like I've worked for the utility, I've worked for local government, and I have worked in the power sector, and we all know that the data is really, really hard to work with. Meters are wonderful and they're terrible, and the data that we're gonna get is gonna be the best that we have at that moment, and then we're gonna have to improve on it on a regular basis, right? So part of that is working with our partners then managing that metering infrastructure to improve what they're able to get out of those meters and provide the right data to all the partners that are interacting in that environment, right? So if you've got a bunch of behind-the-means solar, we need to know both the generation and the consumption on that one. And that can be a challenge. I know in New Hampshire currently is, right? That's super important because one, NEM customers are very vocal. You probably heard that if you were in the community power panel earlier today. They're very vocal, they're very advocates, but right now we can't bring those customers into the community power umbrella because we don't have access to their generation channel, right? It's a completely solvable problem, and that helps us further open up the market to more things like what I was just talking about. The system enhancements also have to address other important things. We have to move a lot of data around. We have to validate that data. There's all the things that come with just taking a ton of it, right? A ton of data and making that accessible to a lot of different parties. And I won't call out names, but there's people in this room that have worked very, very hard just to help actualize the New Hampshire data platform. That's underway, and that's a great pathway for us to eventually, get to some of those goals. The other side of this is the so there's the infrastructure and then there's the system enhancements, right? So we need meters that can ultimately deliver highly granular data so that we can then value that and transact upon that, right? So the metering or really, telemetry, it doesn't have to be meters, it could be something else, but something that gives us that granular usage data and then again, gets into systems that can get it to people very, very quickly is important. And other parts of the grid, right, that bidirectional flow, and then we don't know what new technologies are going to be, right? So having a dynamic grid that is built around an ever-evolving market is going to be important for us to think about as we're making those hardware upgrades. And then finally, market mechanisms are critical, right? So this utopia that I just talked about where I start paying my customers to change how their EV is charging and to use their hot water heater to do frequency control, which they can, by the way, which is really cool. Or to have their Nest thermostat, have 1,000 of my customers turn their thermostat down by 2 degrees or up by 2 degrees, depending on, what I'm trying to accomplish. In order to do that, I have to have really solid data, and I need a market mechanism to then pay you, right? So between bilateral transactions to markets that then allow these different companies to participate in that and allow those aggregations to take place, whether it's, demand response works a lot like that. I get a bunch of providers together, and together I've got 10 megawatts. I aggregate that and I sell that. That's one market mechanism, but there's a lot of other market mechanisms that we need to enable. And importantly, we need to make sure that we're establishing market mechanisms that are technology agnostic, right? We don't want to choose winners and losers. We want the market to solve in the most efficient way possible. So part of that is I don't want to just say I only want heat pumps. Those are great right now, but they might not be the ultimate solution, right? So instead of saying I want heat pumps and this is what I'm going to pay for, instead saying I want this outcome and I'm willing to pay for this outcome, right? And there's lots of other ways to phrase that, right? But something that doesn't establish the technology, but still enables the market to solve for the opportunities before it. It's really important that we proceed on that. And I will say there's a lot of companies that are out there doing it. There's a very innovative company called Recurve Analytics. I think I was talking to one of the representatives in the room there. They have a cool platform. Transactive energy is another interesting thing that's out there. Who knows which one or many of these will likely be the solution, but there's a lot of opportunity for us to get involved in that, and it's going to ultimately deliver a lot of savings to our community and will be an important pathway for the decarbonization of the grid. Okay. Final thoughts, this is just a recap of everything I just said. Not all DERs are the same. They're all going to do different things to the grid. That's great, and that's powerful. But as you heard this morning, we need to be able to orchestrate all of that. So there's a technology infrastructure piece that has to come into play. I cannot overstate how critical it is that we get data, we get it quickly, we get it timely, and that we have really strong validation around that so that we can perform all the things that we're talking about and all the things that our policy wants us to accomplish. And finally, we need system and infrastructure enhancements, with our utility partners, with the grid itself, so that we can really enable all these market mechanisms and outcomes that we're driving for. Okay, That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all our panelists. Now we're going to have a little bit of a panel discussion, so I'm going to ask you guys to turn on your mic that you have on the table there by flipping the switch towards you, I believe. And then I promise we'll leave lots of times for audience questions as well at the end. So if we want to make this clean energy transition happen, we're going to want to deploy a lot of DERs of all the kinds. There's a lot of opportunity out there, but there's also some big barriers and challenges. So this question is mostly for Josh and Matt. If I gave you a magic wand that you could use to solve what you think is a big challenge or barrier to deploying DERs currently, what would you fix with that magic wand that would either, explode deployment or really accelerate it?
Want me to go first?
No, forming my thoughts. Yeah. I think I got it though. So I think if I have to pick one, since I'm in the interconnection space, I'll be selfish and just focus on that. But for New Hampshire specifically, a cost-sharing mechanism put in place today for interconnections so that projects submitting new applications understand that they won't be wholly responsible for the upgrades that their project triggers. And it's important to understand that when we're just talking about business as usual, when a project submits and it triggers an upgrade, the upgrade isn't just installed so that only their project can interconnect. These are all step changes and upgrades at the utility level. So if you have let's just say 34 MVA transformer, and you go over by a megawatt, they're not going to install a 35 MVA transformer. They're going to install a 62 MVA transformer and open up another 30 megawatts. But business as usual, the one project that triggers that pays for it. What I would hope for with my what I would wish for with my magic wand, is all the projects beyond that are sharing in that same upgrade cost so that everyone that's benefiting from the infrastructure is paying for it.
Yeah. All the developers.
We want that too. Yeah.
Hear, hear. I have two answers. The first one, so we do a lot of work with social scientists. I'll tell you why later, but my magic wand would make everyone rational consumers.
That's a big ask. I wish we could
solve
do that. Yeah.
so much that the rest is irrelevant. But I'm an energy nerd, and let me give you the energy nerd answer. And I won't do data because that's what I would normally want to do, but I would have a magic wand that makes everything interoperable with everything else. So everything behind the meter, in front of the meter, all the things that get deployed now and forever in the future, speak the same language, operate the same, can communicate back and forth, and that's one big happy kumbaya of devices. It's Skynet. I want Skynet.
Right. We have a long way to go when my phone and my tablet don't even use the same charger, right? I think we all could benefit from a lot of that standardization.
Yeah.
Deandra, your presentation focused on net metering. Are there any other programs currently in place that the state has that either funds or aims to encourage the development of renewable energy?
Yeah, and I just wanted to mention from also the interconnection issues in the state. You're probably already aware, and some folks in the room, but there is an open proceeding at the department. I believe the goal is a report to the legislature on the interconnection process in the state. So, if you're not involved and are interested in that from a policy perspective, I think it is a public proceeding that, is hopefully going to address some of these issues. Programs that we offer, I'd say we have a number of rebate programs which are available on our website for commercial solar, residential solar, pellet, residential and commercial pellet. And then we do have 2 grant programs. One is focused on LMI community solar, and the RFP for that was just released yesterday. So I can't really talk to folks about it, but it's a grant program. I think it was $1 million out for projects that are LMI community solar projects. And then the non-residential grant program is also currently open. I believe it closes November 16th, and that typically funds biomass and hydro projects in the state. And I believe that was also somewhere around $1 million, and that's currently open. So please apply.
Great, thank you. Maybe back to Matt and Josh. We talked about, needing magic to solve some huge issue. I think, like, in my professional life, I often run up against these little barriers that are like, this wouldn't be that big of a deal to change, right? It's kind of low-hanging fruit. Are there some of these small changes that you all run into in your day-to-day professional lives that you think, it seems like a small challenge, a low-hanging fruit, but this is really something we should work on addressing?
It's actually data related, so that's good. I think in interconnection, we often have this thing called the pre-application report, and if you are a project, anyone, you could be just a homeowner, or you could be a developer like ourselves working on a 5 megawatt project. If you are looking at putting a project in a specific location, you can file a pre-application, and it's relatively low cost. And it provides you with 2 pages that just basically say, at this location, there are this many megawatts or kilowatts of projects already connected, and this many of kilowatts or megawatts that are in the queue that have filed full applications and have yet to be connected. And also, this is the peak and minimum load, and this is the size of the transformer at the substation. That's great, but it's also just a snapshot in time. So it just provides you with, when you file this on November 2nd, 2023, that's what it looks like. And if you wait 1 month to submit your application, someone else may have submitted. So what I would love to see in New Hampshire is each utility puts out a interconnection queue that does not provide specific information about who individuals are, so it's kept anonymous, but it provides locations of projects by just town, by municipality, what substation they're connecting to, what feeder they're on, what the size of the project is, when they submitted their application, and what stage of the process they're in. And a dynamic report that's running like that allows people to see this information regularly and understand, okay, I'm looking at a project on the Monadnock substation in like Peterborough or the Troy area. But I see that there's 4 projects there already. Let's just move on from that one, because there's really not a lot of sense in us putting money into a pre-application report or putting money into a full application, because we likely won't fit onto that substation. So you just kind of move on. And this creates less work for the utility, because then I've not submitted an application that's perfectly prospective and I have no idea what I'm going to get. They don't have to take it and go through all the processes they need to do to make sure it's a complete application, review all of my engineering drawings, etc. It just makes things much more efficient for us, but ideally, if it's done correctly and updated regularly, it will create less work for the utility and for the individuals that are answering a lot of questions from annoying developers like myself.
So it's an interesting question. I came up with a couple of answers, and I was struggling with, would you call this an easy fix? But I guess entertain me on this one. So I think one of the challenges that this is not unique to New Hampshire, really any market, but we often don't have a shared understanding of what the regulatory or legislative language means. Mm-hmm. So we will look at a sentence or group of sentences, and we will collectively decide they mean different things, right? And then we make business decisions based on that interpretation. And it's not until later that we get back together with a counterparty and we say, hey, really excited to do this thing with you. I need A, B, and C. And counterparty's like, I'm giving you A, B, and D because that's what the legislation or that's what the regulation says, right? And when we're like, D's cool, thank you, but I also need C. And so there's back and forth, right? And there's not really this is where I said it's not easy per se, right? And that sometimes you have two choices, right? You either go back to the source and you get clarifying legislation or regulation or a court ruling or something that is very stick, right? The sort of got to beat it into you. Or the other one is you sit down and you have a conversation about what the realm of possibilities are and why for me is it A, B, and C, and why for you is it A, B, and D, and like why are we generating the gap? And having that conversation, again, as sort of rational individuals, but I also spoke this morning about like perception versus perspective, right? And just having that ability to have a counterparty that's willing to look at both your perception as well as the perspective that you're bringing to bear on that, and then making decisions around that. Again, it's not an easy fix. I've probably moved off from what you were asking for.
Yeah, no, I in my former role at Clean Energy New Hampshire, I learned that passing the law was like step one. Yeah. The rules and then actually putting whatever program, incentive, law you passed, actually putting that into action is a lot of it. And it's that interpretation of like, oh, we passed a law. I thought it meant this. They thought it meant that. Oh, what does it actually mean? How are we gonna like put it into action now? All right, so now we're gonna open it up to your questions. I'm gonna come over with this mic and hand you the mic if you have a question for our panelists or for me.
Thank you, Penty Alto. It seems to me that if we got the price right in the first place, we could eliminate a lot of the issue. Today we can get access to the 5-minute price here in New England. We could use that as a pricing signal that gets through to the customer relatively simply. Today I can get the price from Chicago and on a 5-minute basis, and it's available to residential customers if they want it. It's a little tricky because obviously there's risk involved. We could have a Texas type event occur where prices go nuts. So for customers that have the ability to respond to that sort of thing, perhaps that might be one way of getting access for more people. In particular, it gets to the question of the interconnection. If you are restricted on the voltages that you can see on the grid, you may just be able to accept curtailment, and that might be the interconnection procedures to tell you roughly how often you might be curtailed. Put in as big a plan as you want, but just understand that you will be curtailed and how much it might be, and have a price associated with that.
Yeah, I could start on this one. So I agree, pricing is important, right? And having 5-minute pricing or 15-minute pricing or an hour pricing, like you can really transact on any of those. But the challenge comes to if the asset's in front of the meter, that's fine. That's actually not that difficult. And whether it wants to participate in the wholesale market, or you could have some sort of bilateral where you can participate it with like a load modifying resource or any other of the capacities where, assuming the market supports that, you could do that. The challenge starts to come is if that is behind the meter asset and I don't, for example, have access to the generation channel, let's just say it's a battery or a solar and a battery, for example, and I don't get access to the generation channel, then it doesn't matter that you can respond to that price signal. I can't pay you for it because I won't know what you did. And things get more interesting because if we really want to open this up, again, technology agnostic, we want to make everything accessible to this market pricing. Then it gets even more challenging with a lack of relevant and timely data because I need to know your usage. I need to be able to pull out the usage of, say, like your water heater and your EV charging and all these other things and determine, like, use maybe baselines and counterfactuals. There's a lot of really well-established, big data approaches to being able to like use that and then pay people on it. But unless I can do that in a timely manner, then one, it's hard to pay you. Two, the more asynchronous the grid becomes, so like in a heat event or in a cold storm, right? And the less I can understand what's happening on the grid, the less I can accurately send price signals, and the less I can understand how consumers are actually behaving. So if I said, I need as much energy as you can produce, and let's say I thought you were going to give me 5 kilowatts from your battery, but you only gave me 2, but I banked on 5, then I've got 3 that's now exposed to real time prices, right? And so like my hedging strategy goes sideways, my market exposure can go sideways, right? And so it all comes down to that complete and real timely data to really solve for all of those. So yes, that solves for some of it, but we really want to solve for a lot of it.
Just briefly, sorry, touch on the final thing you said there on curtailment. It's a very interesting comment. Texas has issues, and we all see like publicly what has occurred there, but they've also installed more renewables in Texas than many states, I think all states. And they do it because we submit projects to the utility and they study our project in the worst case. So it doesn't happen often, but when the grid voltage drops to this level, you're gonna have this impact on the system, and we don't want that. What Texas does instead is they say, we won't operate you when the worst case happens. We'll just turn your system off and you'll operate 99% of the time otherwise. So that is a very interesting thing that I think Texas might be the only ones doing it right now, but they're certainly leading on it. And I think other states ought to start studying that and determining if it's a worthwhile endeavor for their state as an option for operators like ourselves.
It would be hard, though, as a developer, I would think, that if you don't have clarity over how often you may get curtailed, you're not going to be able to model out your expected generation, right? It will add some uncertainty in your future revenue because there would be uncertainty in your future output. Right.
Hi, I'm Gunnar Pope from BitStory AI. I do some forecasting and modeling, and I'm hearing this reoccurring challenge of all of the power and energy that's in interconnection queue. So I'm wondering if you had a magic wand and you could get access to data streams or analytics that could help get as much renewables into and through the interconnection queue as possible, what data would that be, or what type of analytics would grease the wheel?
So understanding what is in utilities' long-term plans for upgrades. What substations will they be upgrading? Where are they planning long-term infrastructure improvements? That is helpful, and it's not interconnection information, but it's taking a proactive look at the grid rather than a reactive one, because we're constantly just submitting applications with limited information about what's happening on the grid. But if we can understand that the utility is going to be working on a certain substation, we may file a project there. So Massachusetts is working on this capital investment project, and they essentially took all of these projects that have been in the interconnection queue for 5 years or so, studied them all together, said that we need to build transformers that are this size, and they overbuilt it to allow headroom for future projects. So understanding where those capital investment projects that the utilities are going to be working on are going to be placed on the grid is very important.
Any other questions? All the way over there. Perfect.
How many group net metering and municipal group net metering projects are currently operating in the state?
Good question. I believe there are somewhere around between 350 and 400 group net metering registered groups in the state. A lot of those, group net metering is often used as a solution where your garage and your house and you want to share. So I'd say a lot of them are those. I think it's, with some of these legislative changes in the past few years, we're seeing, more real groups come online. I believe the municipal group hosting, there may be 3 or 4 that have been approved since the legislation passed. So very new.
Right. The group net metering applies to a lot of different situations, right? I think I may have broken your report spreadsheet with my 152 member group. I was like, I need a new spreadsheet.
Oh yeah, you're one of the municipals.
Yeah, I have 2 municipals.
Any other questions?
I want to just follow up on the data discussion because I agree that seems to be critical. And I'm certainly not an expert in this field, but my guess is that we've got a pretty good protocol on how to pass data back and forth for facilities that are in front of the meter. But my guess is that there really is no standard protocol for data behind the meter. And quite frankly, I would guess the meter is one of the problems. What do we need to do to make sure that the information from those distributed energy sources behind the meter can get baked into the pie, so to speak? And do we need to upgrade the meters? Do we need to create a whole new kind of a network that's, internet-based? I mean, what's the solution?
Great question. So we actually do have well-established data communication channels. So in any retail market where you have competition, the utility has to send data to other parties. It's the nature of it. And so we use EDI is the format, right? What we send the data in. And that works in the billing context because I need a month of usage and then I can calculate it and then send a bill and that type of thing. And so timeliness is a much more relevant thing in that. But what is perhaps what needs to change is that yes, so there has to be some updates to that. The EDI construct is many things, and so sometimes you just need to update how you're formatting and providing the data in there. As metering changes, so here's a great example of where opportunities were missed that should be solved for in other markets. So when California rolled out their AMI meters, so we've got interval meters really across the state, they all plugged into the meter data management system, MDMS. So they're ingesting all that interval data, but they didn't make changes to their technology stack past that. And so the output of that was still monthly data, which is no better than what we had before, right? And so, yes, it's useful for a handful of use cases that the utility needed it for, but for all the downstream side of it, for all the retail, for all the innovative programs and offerings, it took years of arm wringing and regulatory engagement to sort of break that out to start getting access to the interval data, right? So we don't want to do that, right? So it's really about, yes, we need to exchange data as timely as possible, but that data exchange also needs to be in the context of the different use cases that are around there. So yes, you need billing and you need all these formats, and it's not just usage data, but you need all the other customer characteristics, and that has to get solved for. Most of it is, but it needs to be updated. But we also need to make sure that as we upgrade our systems and infrastructure, that we're really solving across the whole thing there. So both from the new thing going into the ground or the new meter getting installed all the way to what that intended output is supposed to be, and solving for all the systems in between there and making sure that we're able to do that in a way that's timely, and two, that we can deliver it in an accurate and reasonable way so that can be accessible and usable to all the counterparties that would use it to do all of these things.
And I'll give you a really sort of simple data wish that we had. So our hydros, our group hosts, we have to file that annual report. So I have to show what our generation was and all of our members' monthly usage. Some of our hydros are sizable, so we have a lot of members. So each and every one of their accounts, currently, I have to ask them to send me a PDF copy of their bills. I have to re-enter their usage in a spreadsheet to send it to the utility that already has that information, so that they can check that my members used the same amount that I generated. We operate in other states. In other states, the member just gives us permission to access their information through a data portal. We are working on that in New Hampshire, but it cannot come fast enough. The data is there. It's just the same information that they use to bill their customers. We just need to have access to how much did they use that month on that account. The data exists. We need to work on an exchange and permission to safely have access to the data.
I think this is a question for Matt about interconnection points. I was really shocked to hear that there was an 8-year waiting list in, I think it was Massachusetts. And I'm wondering if all of the projects in the lineup are some of them placeholders? For example, if a utility already owns the land and they're sort of speculating, they put in a placeholder. So are viable projects getting stuck behind placeholders? And then a further question is, are some of them deliberately put in place in order to delay, in order to squash development from smaller projects?
So on our side, as far as I'm aware, utilities are restricted from filing applications that would go into their own interconnection queue. They need to go through a separate process. But it does get to an issue where developers are actually getting in the way of other developers, and filing maybe a very prospective project that they haven't started permitting yet. Maybe they don't even have a great relationship with the landowner, but they're just trying to hold queue space. Massachusetts does a great job of making sure that there's a high barrier to entry to enter the interconnection queue, which is very important. In New Hampshire, we currently don't have an application fee for interconnections, which means it's a very low barrier to entry, and you just have a lot of prospective projects throwing their hat in the ring, basically just saying, well, there's no fee, might as well throw a project in there, and maybe I spoke with this landowner like 6 months ago, so they probably won't check. Having an application fee is another very like low-hanging fruit thing, because you have very small projects that maybe can't afford the same thing as the projects that we're working on, so you just make it a sliding scale cost per kilowatt so that it's fair for everyone. But at least it makes sure that there's some sort of financial requirement in place so that someone can't just throw an application in and wait for years on a project that might never happen.
Why does it take so long?
Sequencing of studies, which is something that Massachusetts is doing better than others in the sense that they're grouping studies together. In New Hampshire, we currently sequence studies one at a time. So you literally might do one project, one study in the state at a time. One thing that I would love to see New Hampshire do is each substation at least has one system impact study going at a time. Ideally, we're at a scenario where you're grouping these projects and these substations together to move them all forward more quickly. But I would take just one study per substation at a time right now. It can take a long time for a lot of different reasons, and it can get to, as Madeleine referenced earlier, the transmission side as well. 5 megawatts is like the magic line in the sand where you don't cross if you don't want to have ISO New England looking at what you're doing. But when you have a cluster of these 5 or 4.99 megawatt projects, they may all have an impact on the transmission system, and so they get clustered together and studied by ISO New England. So not only are we grouped together to be studied by the utility at the distribution level, but we're also studied at the transmission level. So it takes a long time because those clusters need to move forward, and then the next cluster can move forward.
All right, we've got 3 minutes left, so this is probably going to be our last question. But our panelists will be around if you want to corner them.
I had a question for Deandra about kind of a couple part question on those LMI
community solar projects.
Yeah. So, one, how were the parameters of the ruling there decided? Was that data driven in terms of, how feasible, how likely it would be for projects like that to be done? Mm-hmm. And then two, from a developer standpoint, I'm curious, is that extra 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour and all the other incentives about that enough to incentivize people to develop those?
Mm-hmm. Yep, good questions. So the requirements, the income requirements and the types of members, number of members is directly from the statute. So all of that was developed through the legislative process, which I am not involved in. So that's where all of those come from. We currently have 2 registered LMI community solar projects. I believe the statute was passed in 2017 or 18, so it is relatively new, but to your point, we have 2 active projects. There was, I mentioned in the presentation, legislation passed around this EAP, Electric Assistance Program, these LMI community solar projects using, those members. I think one of the things that we've been hearing, or legislators have been hearing, is that recruiting members, managing members is a very high cost issue. And so I think this SB 270 in 2022 is meant in some ways to help address that by basically having the members allocated by the utility from the existing EAP lists. And then the groups are largely also managed throughout the year by the utility based on certain requirements. So it's meant to lower the administrative costs of those types of projects.
As a non-solar person, I'll say, you were saying LMI, I know the grants are for solar only. Is the LMI adder for net metering only for solar, or any net metering eligible technology?
It cues off of the definition of LMI, low moderate income community solar project. So it is currently specific to solar projects based on the legislation.
Well, thank you all so much. We're going to thank our panelists. Thank you all for attending our session today.